À-bas-le-ciel.
Irony of ironies, it seems like the whole book falls into exactly the trap it's trying to avoid. And it just idiosyncratically picks and chooses the things that the author finds gratifying or amusing to talk about and treats them as effective activism with absolutely no empirical basis, without even rigorously arguing it, without even looking at an honest and open-minded way at the type of anecdotal evidence we all have. It is unbelievable to me how unsophisticated this argument is in its use of the data, if you can even call that data. That's the only thing I can praise here, is when he's saying other people's approaches are not scientific. And then the bizarre thing is, this book proceeds to offer you an approach that is itself totally unscientific. Actually, I should mention one more thing. I should digress. His experience as a clinical psychologist is also incredibly biased, because the people he's talking to are either paying money to receive his advice on how to change their lives as a clinical psychologist, or they're stuck in his office because a court order, a judge, or some kind of police authority forced them to sit in his office and listen to his advice. That is totally different from the type of situation we're in as vegans, trying to motivate people to take an interest in doing the right thing for the right reason and become vegan.
À-bas-le-ciel.
This is yet another video apologizing for not presenting a book review. This is a non-book review. Or no, it's a book non-review. That's what it is. So you guys know I've been forcing myself to read Dr. Casey Taft's book, Motivational Methods for Vegan Advocacy. And I mean, this book is just a waste of your time. It is just a waste of your time. The only part of the book I can praise is where he is in just a few pages attacking the methodology of some of the other groups that make pseudoscientific claims. These are claims within the social sciences, but that make seemingly scientific claims about what is and what is not effective advocacy. Now, I think I'm going to make another video about that, dealing especially with the animal charity evaluators. Sorry, let's see if I can just get the name of that charity right. Yes, I did get it right. ACE, Animal Charity Evaluators, and other groups making pseudoscientific claims about the effectiveness of different forms of activism. So that's the only thing I can praise here, is when he's saying other people's approaches are not scientific. And then the bizarre thing is, this book proceeds to offer you an approach that is itself totally unscientific. Now, I made a comment on Twitter the other day. I'm new to Twitter. I said, look, a lot of these claims about what is effective activism are inherently absurd, because when it comes right down to it, we're talking about propaganda, and propaganda is a form of art. Effective activism is effective art. Now, why did I say that? I'm insinuating that there are limits to what we can approach in a metrical, scientific way. To some extent, we're going to have to embrace the richness and diversity of human experience and the ineluctably unscientific reality of the fact that one work of art, moves an audience emotionally and another doesn't. Whether you're talking about cinema or painting or performance art or stand-up comedy, it is peculiar. I mean, it's also peculiar. Sometimes you have a work of art, and at the time it's first made, it doesn't find an audience, it doesn't resonate with an audience, and then decades later, for some reason, it gets rediscovered, and it goes from being unknown to being famous. The arts are full of these kinds of contradictions. And I do think propaganda is an art. I do have a background in the social sciences. I do think the social sciences have some important lessons for us to consider in veganism. But I mean, this is bizarre. Casey Taft's approach, it's just a series of these self-selected, incredibly biased anecdotes that only favor his own argument. I'll just give you an example. This is from page 109. He just says, even the most offensive non-vegan who is in the pre-contemplation stage of change has the potential to someday go vegan. I have heard many vegans tell me that they once used to troll vegan Facebook pages, making hateful comments about loving the taste of animals, and yet they ended up going vegan. It's like, okay, again, this is not brilliantly written. The argument really just is, it consists of a long series of totally disorganized, self-selected anecdotes like that. One time I had this conversation on the internet, and one time I talked to somebody on Facebook or via email. Once I talked to this guy, and it is unbelievable to me how unsophisticated this argument is in its use of the data, if you can even call that data. I've worked as an editor of nonfiction, academic nonfiction especially. And many people with PhDs, they think about writing a report in a way that's completely abstracted from the audience. No thought whatsoever has gone into how this book would be useful for the person reading it. I say, as an editor, when I was given a manuscript of a book, very often written by someone with a PhD, most of my projects were, I would often have to confront the author and say, look, here near the start of the book, you got 30 pages that are totally worthless to the audience for this book, to the reader for this book. And sometimes they would get offended and get angry and fight over it or something. But they had never thought, who is going to read this book? Who is this for? How is this book going to be useful to this person? And among other obvious implications of just thinking that way, thinking what the audience is ready for, is not providing information they already know, right? Like, who is going to read this? The title is Motivational Methods for Vegan Advocacy, a Clinical Psychology Perspective. So only people who are already really experienced with exactly these types of bullshit anecdote experiences. Nobody is going to read this book who is at such a level of jejune ignorance they would be blown away by these anecdotes. Like, wow, really? You once talked to a guy on Facebook who said he used to be a troll and now he's being... Wow, tell me more. Like, none of this is going to be new or surprising to the very small audience of people like myself who would read it. And then what's done with that data and the various kind of ethical and normative claims here, it's not, to me, the problem is not that it's pseudoscience. I've already explained. I think in some ways what we're talking about here is much more art than science. This just cannot be useful. So I already have another video that's already up on YouTube where I talk about the peculiar role of social justice as a concept in Casey Taft's approach to this. I believe the title of that video is simply "Veganism is not a social justice movement." It's a very poorly written book. It fails both in living up to its own scientific pretensions, and it fails to be useful in a more broadly heuristic, educational, or artistic sense. Now, do I think that the challenge for motivational methods in vegan advocacy, do I think that the challenge for motivational methods in vegan advocacy, do I think that is a purely artistic challenge? No. I think there are actually a lot of lessons we can take from the social sciences and social science methodology. I said this really briefly in my last conversation with Mod Vegan. But I said, look, I know what it's like to do real outcome evaluation in the social sciences. We have a baseline and a midline and endline. I know how those methods are used. I know how outcomes are measured. They have all this pretentious language in that field. You design the instrument and carry out the field work and do the study and so on. At a minimum, with no budget, just us having a conversation here on YouTube or via Skype, I think there's really like a philosophical sense in which we have a lot to learn about effective activism from social science research methods. Can we actually use those methods to improve what we're doing here and now in veganism in 2017? I think the simple answer is no, because nobody has the budget, and also nobody is going to be intellectually honest about what those findings are, and nobody has the rigor or even the motivation to use those findings in a meaningful way. Now, Casey Taft himself gives me a great example of this. Early on, in the first couple chapters, sorry, I forget if it's chapter 1 or chapter 2, quite early on in the book, Casey dismisses most of the social science research that's gone into effective activism so far by saying that it is completely worthless to ask meat eaters what would or would not be effective vegan activism, for the same reason he claims that it would be useless to ask racists, to ask people who may be, for example, neo-Nazis, what would be effective in educating them to, be more accepting of blacks or Jews or whoever it is they're racist against. Now, to me, that is just mind-blowingly, self-evidently wrong, and makes me think that Casey Taft, even though he has this background in clinical psychology, has absolutely no understanding of what this kind of social science research is or why it would matter for veganism. The exact opposite of that statement is true. It's incredibly important and incredibly worthwhile, for example, to go into prisons and talk to white people who are members of neo-Nazi gangs and talk to them about why they're racist and how they first joined the gang, what their motives are, and what their worldview is. It is actually, the exact opposite of what he's saying is how social science research works. It's so important to reach out to and try to understand those people and understand the contradictions they have in their lives. Like most of those guys, talking about people who identify as racists, they do at the same time have cooperative relationships with black people and Portuguese people at their workplace, and then yet they go home and they're racist. So you can talk to them about how they live, how they balance this ideology with the reality of, some of them, I know it sounds ridiculous, some of them literally do have non-white friends, and yet they're racist. And it's crucially important to interview people who are going through the stages of, some people say deprogramming, of exiting maybe a cult-like racist group, and then to interview them afterwards, to do, baseline, midline, endline study, and talk to them about what was effective for them. This is the absolute bread and butter. This is the basic, this, you care, you claim that you care about social science research and having a rigorous scientific approach to understanding what is and what isn't effective in vegan advocacy, and yet the most basic kind of broadly philosophical concepts we could take from the social sciences for veganism are dismissed right in chapter 1. So that is bizarre to me. That is surreal. And throughout the whole book, again, I think it's partly just that Casey Taft is a bad author. He just states things really in a religious fashion, as if he's in a position to declare self-evident truths with no empirical basis and no examination and no argumentation of self-doubt. He'll just say something like, at the cognition stage, the most important element of veganism to argue is the ethical argument, because, he just makes these claims about how you should present veganism in terms of ethics rather than other factors, disregarding even the few scientific studies that are talked about here. Probably the only scientific finding we have right now, by the way, about what is effective in people remaining vegan, very interesting, is the sense of revulsion, the sense of disgust, that people who cultivate an aversion to, that they find meat revolting, stay vegan, and many who don't feel that way go back to eating meat. Dead obvious, but that's the kind of thing you learn through social science research, is that actually feelings of aversion and disgust that meat is gross and so on, and dairy and eggs and so on. That's actually an important part of people becoming and remaining vegan, which maybe is not flattering to you ideologically. Maybe you'd prefer to think it's a purely ethical case or purely political decision or something, but it's not. So that kind of thing can show up in social science research. Again, so there's art and science and stand-up comedy here. I talk for ethics for hours and hours on my channel, but I would be the first person to admit, in all due humility, some people have zero interest in the ethical arguments, just on a case-by-case basis, just idiosyncratically, and it'll never matter. And on the other hand, being brutally honest and even insulting with some people, especially, I've got to say, with heterosexual men, can often have a really lasting impression on them. Actually, I should mention one more thing. I should digress. His experience as a clinical psychologist is also incredibly biased, because the people he's talking to are either paying money to receive his advice on how to change their lives as a clinical psychologist, or they're stuck in his office because a court order, a judge, or some kind of police authority forced them to sit in his office and listen to his advice. That is totally different from the type of situation we're in as vegans, trying to motivate people to take an interest in doing the right thing for the right reason and become vegan, right? If someone paid me in the role of a therapist to coach them on becoming vegan, totally different scenario. If somebody is forced to sit in my office and be counseled by me because the judge sentenced them to do so many hours of counseling with a therapist, that's totally different. And he is completely, utterly biased by this experience, his professional experience as a clinical therapist. He doesn't realize how utterly inapplicable most of this stuff is. Irony of ironies, it seems like the whole book falls into exactly the trap it's trying to avoid. And it just idiosyncratically picks and chooses the things that the author finds gratifying or amusing to talk about and treats them as effective activism with absolutely no empirical basis, without even rigorously arguing it, without even looking at an honest and open-minded way at the type of anecdotal evidence we all have. Before my digression, I was just saying, look, I like to talk about ethics. I like to talk about politics. I don't even want to guess what percentage of my fellow human beings want to hear those arguments, least of all in relation to veganism. My experience on planet Earth, whether it's in Laos or Cambodia or Canada, very few people are sincerely interested in having a lecture on ethics. Under any circumstances, least of all in relation to veganism, very few people are really interested in politics. It's a very loud minority because people who talk about politics get on TV every night, but it's really, if you're being honest with yourself, it's a minority. And if you're not in a context where someone is either paying money for a therapist or being forced to talk to a therapist by a judge, you start to, even if it's just in an anecdotal way, see that, in accordance with the great diversity of human personality types, all kinds of different methods turn out to be effective, even if they are, in a theoretical sense, methodologically wrong. So there's a lot of material here on how to be a good listener, which I think is of absolutely zero use to anyone who would, read this book. Like how you're supposed to sit down, as he does in his office as a therapist, and make the person feel validated and listened to and heard and all this shit. Even if it's wrong, all of us, if you're experienced as a vegan, examples from your own life where you maybe said something rude and contemptuous and dismissive to someone, but it struck home and the honesty of it stayed with them and inspired them to become vegan, or at least inspired them to become reducitarian. Especially in my interactions with heterosexual men, I've often pointed out, for one thing, a lot of heterosexual men like it when you don't bullshit them. And this, if we're being all the way honest, this is pretty much a guide to how to bullshit people. So they often just respond to the honesty, even if it's a little bit brusque or a little bit insulting. And, the same way that, a coach may motivate people in a sport, not by saying this is going to be easy, you're going to be so good at it. You can motivate people also by talking about how hard something is going to be, right? Like, you don't have to come into this saying, oh, but veganism is so rewarding and it's so easy and you can do it and everyone else finds it easy. You can say, yeah, you know what? It's hard. It's hard emotionally. It's hard practically. Yeah, it's going to fuck up your lunch schedule. It's going to fuck up, every time you go on a date with a woman. Yeah, it's a burden. Yeah, it's hard, but guess what? It's the right thing to do. And what? Are you too weak or too stupid or too lazy or too cowardly to do the right thing? You can have those conversations. But he's saying, given that this is just working from a mess of anecdotes, and it's picking and choosing those anecdotes in this kind of dishonest way, in my opinion, the anecdotes don't favor this kind of methodology at all. Because, again, anecdotally, you can have the experience. Many of you will have had it repeatedly. You just say to somebody contemptuously, when they tell you that, they think veganism is morally correct, but they could never do it themselves because it's inconvenient or for some specific reason. You may say something pretty contemptuous like, well, you know what? 1,000 years ago, the world seemed to be full of men who were willing to stand up and fight and die over a point of moral principle. And these days, it seems like everyone is so lazy and so self-indulgent that it's too much to ask for them to stand up and do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And you might say something even more insulting. You might say to them, yeah, well, I guess you're just a coward. I guess you're not willing, to take this incredibly tiny risk of trying to be vegan because it's the right thing to do. I guess in various words, you may let them know that you perceive them as lazy and immoral and a bad person. And so that's breaking every rule in this book. And yet that same person may come back to you months later and say, wow, what you said really stuck with me. And now I really try to be vegan. Maybe they're not vegan. Maybe they become reducitarian, but maybe they become vegan too. I've had those kinds of interactions on the internet. I've had them face to face with people. I've had so many situations where I was talking to this person and I thought they were just wasting my time. And I was being quite brusque and insulting. And then I heard back from them months later that they did become vegan. Now, am I going to build a methodology out of that? No. I mean, this is like, what are you going to do? What do the social science methods tell us about stand-up comedy? What do the social science methods tell us? Look, I have a background in academic religious studies. Maybe there's more that we can learn from, how religions are preached, how people convert and deconvert from religious beliefs. I don't know. Probably a lot of the social sciences have different rules to teach us. But I guess the fundamental delusion that each of these academic authors brings to the game is they try to argue that the social sciences have one lesson for all of veganism, for all of vegan activism and advocacy, and we have to support their conclusions. And look, all this stuff comes down to cultural and linguistic factors also. I already think this book is a piece of shit if you're living in Canada, the United States. Do you think even Casey Taft himself would have the delusion that you could take his conclusions and apply them to Japan, apply them to Taiwan, apply them to Scotland? I've lived in Scotland. It's significantly different. Even France, even Germany, cultures where meat and meat eating are so different. And, in saying that already, now you realize just how anecdotal and just how incoherent the data you're working from is. So what do you think? Within the United States, do you really think it's going to be the same in New York City as it is in Texas? Do you really think it's going to be the same if you're talking to white wealthy people as opposed to maybe, poor or middle-class Hispanic people? So again, as thin as the pretense of scientism is in this kind of study, then when you bring in those cultural factors, it gets so thin as to be absurd. I can tell you, Casey Taft's book, I think the basic problem is that he just did not put any thought whatsoever into who his audience was, who would actually read the book, and what would be useful for them to know. And I do think it lacks the incredibly high level of honesty and rigor and humility that it would take to really reflect on, the incoherent and anecdotal reality of what does convert people to being vegan, and then to try to take steps forward in drawing up some kind of, conclusions or lessons from that. As I said on Twitter, part of the puzzle here is simply that propaganda is an art form. So when we are talking about effective advocacy, we are talking about effective art. And that is almost a paradox, almost a contradiction in terms.
À-bas-le-ciel.